Σε γνωρίζω από την κόψη του σπαθιού την τρομερή. Σε γνωρίζω από την όψη που με μετράει τη γη. Απ' τα κόκαλα βγαλμένη των Ελλήνων τα ιερά και σαν πρώτα ανδριωμένη, χαίρε ο χαίρε ελευθεριά. Και σαν πρώτα ανδριωμένη, χαίρε ο χαίρε ελευθεριά. Και σαν πρώτα ανδριωμένη, χαίρε ο χαίρε ελευθεριά.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα σας και χρόνια πολλά. Σας καλωσορίζω στην έδρα Ελληνικών Σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου Μιζούρι. Ιδρυμένη το 1993, η έδρα είναι μία από τις αρχαιότερες έδρες ελληνικών σπουδών στη Βόρεια Αμερική. Πρικοδοτημένη από το Υπουργείο Εξωτερικών της Ελλάδας, την ελληνική κοινότητα του Σεντ Λούις και την πολιτεία του Μιζούρι, έχει εξελιχθεί σε μείζωνα πόλο ανάπτυξης των ελληνικών σπουδών και διατήρησης της ταυτότητας του ελληνισμού στην καρδιά της Αμερικής. Η σημερινή εκδήλωση είναι η πρώτη από σειρά δράσεων για τον εορτασμό των 200 ετών από την Ελληνική Επανάσταση. Επειδή η πλειονότητα του ακροατηρίου των ακροατών μας είναι αγγλόφωνοι, θα μου επιτρέψετε να συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Synhellenes and Philhellenes, on behalf of the Hellenic Government Caracas Foundation Professorship in Greek Studies at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and the Hellenic communities of Missouri and Southwest Illinois, I would like to welcome you to our first of our series of events honoring and celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Greek War of Independence. The Greek professorship at AMSL is one of the oldest Greek chairs in the US, endowed by the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the local Greek community, and the state of Missouri. Over the past quarter of a century, it has become a major factor in the growth of Greek studies and the strengthening of Hellenism in the Midwest. We run a wide range of research, teaching, and public outreach programs that serve our students, our Greek American community, and the wider public. For more information, I would like to invite you to visit our website, greekstudies.org, which is the gateway to all of our programs. Today's lecture kickstarts a series of events honoring and celebrating the bicentennial of the Greek War of Independence. These events include 5 lectures, 4 films, 2 exhibitions at the Matsakis Center, 1 music concert, and 1 scholarly conference. This is our Greece in Missouri 21 initiative. Initially, our plans were to hold all these events in person this year, but the pandemic forced us to modify the program and hold the 2021 events virtually, with the hope that in 2022, we will return to in-person events. The initiative is held under the auspices of the Greek Embassy in the United States, for which I would like to thank the Ambassador to the USA, Her Excellency Mrs. Alexandra Papadopoulou. It is also held in coordination with the Consulate General of Greece in Chicago, and it is my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Ambassador Ekaterini Dimakis, Consul General of Greece in Chicago, who will deliver a brief greeting. Your Excellency, welcome to Missouri.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kosmopoulos, for organizing this event at the University of St. Louis, Missouri, as well as a series of other events that will follow as you described, in commemoration and celebration of the bicentennial of the beginning of the Greek Revolution. I would also like to thank Professor Hyrieas for presenting to us today aspects of the Greek War of Independence. Last week, Greece and the Greek diaspora all over the world commemorated our National Day with spectacular and moving celebrations. In this respect, I would like to congratulate our Greek compatriots in the Midwest and in Missouri in particular for their achievements and for contributing to the strengthening of the ties between Greece and the USA. Dear friends, Greek diaspora played an essential role in the revolution, and especially in the years before the revolution, as the Greek Enlightenment was critical in shaping the national consciousness, and thus in paving the way for the success of the revolution. They also worked hard to gather and send to the revolutionaries supplies, ammunition, and money, while they ardently defended the Greek cause in the civilized nations wherever they happened to live. The role of Andamandios Korais, for instance, was instrumental not only in France and Europe, but also in the United States through his friendship with President Jefferson. Dear friends, the Greek Revolution and the almost 10-year independence war that resulted in the creation of the modern Greek state is undoubtedly an enormous milestone of the Greek history. This year, the Greeks try to present, discuss, and shed light on several aspects of this milestone. We try to bring forward and underline not only main events, but also details, or perhaps unknown facets of the revolution. Therefore, I look forward to today's presentation and discussion, and I thank you all for being with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We appreciate it, and it's good to see your face. Because of the pandemic, you have not been able to come to St. Louis, and I know
Absolutely.
that under other circumstances, we would have loved to have welcomed you to our city.
I do hope that this opportunity will be offered very soon, and I look forward to meet you all from close very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. We are honored to have you here with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you noticed the beginning video, but I should tell you that the University of Missouri has raised the Greek flag over its central administration building in commemoration of the bicentennial of Greek Independence Day. Honestly, I was hoping that we could get to illuminate the St. Louis Arch. It just turns out that you need federal permissions for that. So there was no time to do that. So we are celebrating, we are participating in this series of monuments around the world that are being illuminated with raising the Greek flag at the university. Today's lecture, as I mentioned, the first in our Greece in Missouri 21 initiative, is the annual Memorial Sam Nakis Lecture. And I would like to express on behalf of all of us, faculty, students, and members of the community, our gratitude to the Nakis family for their generosity in endowing this lecture. The speaker, Vicky Hyrieas, is well known to our community. She came to AMSL 2 years ago with her husband, Professor Nikos Michailidis, and the two of them have been valuable additions to our Greek studies team at the university. Vicky has studied English literature at UCLA, late antique and Byzantine history at King's College London, where she got her first MA, and classics at the University of California, Irvine, where she got her second MA. Currently, she is completing her PhD at Princeton University. Her research interests are the social, political, and cultural history of the Byzantine and post-Byzantine periods, She is particularly interested in the social dimensions of violence during these periods and how violence relates to memory, authority, and hierarchy. At AMSL, she has been teaching courses on Greek culture and history and has brought to our program a much-needed expertise in Byzantine and post-Byzantine periods. Her lecture today will focus on the intellectual networks that made possible the Greek Revolution and the liberation from the Ottomans. Vicky, thank you for agreeing to give this lecture to our community. We are all yours.
Thank you so much for that incredibly flattering introduction. Let me go ahead and start by sharing my screen. Okay, did I do that correctly? Is that fine?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, wonderful. So again, I want to thank Professor Kosmopoulos for inviting me to speak today and the Greek professorship at UMSL for organizing this event. I would also like to recognize Her Excellency Ambassador Dimakis and thank her for being here with us today. And of course, I want to thank the members of the Greek community and the church for their support and everyone in attendance today. So this year marks a very special anniversary for Greece. It's the bicentennial of the Greek Revolution. In this presentation, I want to engage with a question I've heard asked quite a few times, which is, why did the Greek Revolution begin in 1821, and why didn't they fight for their independence sometime sooner, in those 368 years after Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans? So to answer these questions, we're going to look at 4 factors that led to the Greek Revolution. There we go. The first point is creating a vision and a new meaning to what it means to be Greek, international recognition and support, internal organization and support, and finally, grassroots organizing and guerrilla fighting. I'd like to start, though, by walking a few centuries back from 1821 to first understand the foundation for who these writers and fighters were of the revolutionary movement and how they saw themselves and why they wanted to push for an independent state in the first place. Their shared identity and passion for an independent Greek state has roots in ancient Greek and Byzantine history, but since I happen to be a Byzantine historian myself, I'm just going to start from there. So Byzantium is an often overlooked part of history, so I'll quickly jog everyone's memory. The Byzantine Empire began around 325 when Constantine the Great established his empire in the small port of Byzantium and renamed it New Rome, or Konstantinoupolis, which literally means the city of Constantine. And this lasted for over 1,000 years. The empire saw territorial expansion and contraction through the centuries, and it went from this massive empire that you see here in front of you to this incredibly small empire that you see here that remains in purple. So despite the relative geographic instability of the empire through its over millennium of power, it was an economic, educational, technological, cultural, and military beacon for the broader Mediterranean and its adjacent areas. Neighboring states and groups surrounding the Byzantine Empire fervently mimicked them and frequently sought their approval. And we see this in the way that emissaries recorded their awe when entering the Byzantine court, how neighboring people and powers adopted Byzantine administrative systems, Byzantine art and architectural trends that appear in the Islamic world and in the West, and in the presence of Orthodox Christianity in Bulgaria, Russia, Serbia, and Ethiopia, for example. So to put it simply, Byzantium was a power that made a lasting impression, not just for its own people, for Greeks, but for its neighbors as well. However, good things often have to come to an end, and on May 29th, 1453, the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman conquerors. While there are no confirmed accounts of what happened to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Palaiologos, we do have several different versions of the events. Some sources claim that he died fighting in battle, others that he hanged himself to avoid capture by the Ottomans, while others say he cowardly changed into civilian clothes to escape Ottoman capture and fled the empire. But by the late 15th century, folktales and legends begin to circulate that Constantine Palaiologos wasn't really dead and that he would come back to rescue his people from their slavery to the Turks. One particularly popular prophecy was that an angel swept up the emperor just as he was going to be killed in battle, and he was turned into a marble and concealed in a subterranean cave near the Golden Gate to the city. Now, the Golden Gate was the main entry gate of Constantinople, where emperors would march through after returning from the war victorious. So there's a symbolic meaning to him hiding near the Golden Gate. So according to this legend, the Emperor Constantine is asleep and he awaits the angel's call to wake up and retake Constantinople and chase the Turks far away. Now I bring up this prophecy of the Marble Emperor because it reveals a shared desire for liberation and shared identity and belonging to the Byzantine Empire, with Constantine Palaiologos leading the way. So this idea of shaking off the Ottoman yoke was shared and expressed very early on and created a foundation for what we'll see in the rest of this presentation. This connection with Byzantium was brought up after the success of the revolution in Greece with the Megali Idea, or the Great Idea as it's called in English. This was the concept of regaining the former Byzantine territory that was conquered by the Ottomans and including it in the formation of the modern Greek state. This would include populations of Greeks who were still under Ottoman rule at the time and territory that was historically Greek. But returning to the conquest in 1453, the Ottomans were a group of people, a group of nomadic warriors who migrated westward from the Mongolian plains, and like many other groups and states around them, had their eye on the jewel of the Mediterranean, which was Constantinople. The custom for Islamic warriors at the time was to plunder a conquered city for 3 days. The Ottoman soldiers pillaged, raped, and murdered until the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II ordered the violence and destruction come to a halt on the 3rd day. He ordered the Christian citizens who had escaped death or enslavement to be left alone and to be allowed to return to their homes, though many were left homeless due to the incredible destruction to the city's buildings. The centuries that followed saw the Greek Christian population of the growing Ottoman Empire separated into a group called the Rum Millet, where they were subject to extra taxes and different treatment under the justice system, to name just a few forms of the discrimination that they faced. Byzantine culture, meaning language, literature, religion, and so on, that Greeks continued perpetuating under Ottoman rule, was maintained in large part through the church. People went to the church in their area. Priests and bishops helped adjudicate matters between Orthodox Christians, and the patriarch was ultimately responsible for collecting taxes from Greek Christians, which were then paid to the Ottomans. We can think about the relationship that the Greeks had to the church under Ottoman rule to the way that Greek communities function in the diaspora. As we all know very well, Greek cultural activities in America are typically organized around the church community. So the Ottoman occupation was punctuated by revolts throughout the centuries, but these were short-lived, unsuccessful, and localized. There are, of course, other factors to why these revolts were unsuccessful, but we don't have the time to get into that here. What's important, though, is that there is evidence of Greek dissatisfaction with the ruling power, but until the years running up to 1821, there was no concerted, organized effort on a large scale. Additionally, there was also a portion of Greeks who had found an alternate way to avoid subjugation by the Ottomans, and that was to work their way into the administrative system so that they were at the top of the power structure and not below it. Excuse me. Sorry, one second there. So there were Greek tax farmers Greek soldiers, and various other levels of social, political, and economic elite that members of this room-elite successfully elevated themselves to. So for people like them, overturning the Ottoman state wasn't something that they needed to do to find success, because they found success and it was through the Ottoman power structure. Now, with this foundation down, we can begin talking about how the idea of an independent Greece came about. And I'll return to those questions I presented in the beginning. While there were instances of resistance against the Ottomans during this period of occupation of Greece, what made the years running up to 1821 different? Why hadn't this fight for independence happened in the 368 years following the conquest of Constantinople? The destruction of the Byzantine Empire meant that a proportion of the intellectual, economic, and political elite who didn't survive in Constantinople either fled to Western Europe, which is how the Renaissance began. They were killed, or they lost their wealth and status seemingly overnight. So the infrastructure that's necessary to create a serious resistance movement was destroyed by the conquests, and the Greeks who retained a sense of identity and unity had to start from square one. It's also very important to note that the 18th and 19th centuries became the age of revolutions against monarchic regimes and empires. And so here we can think of the American and the French revolutions. And the Greek Revolution was born out of this era. Of course, it's important to remember that revolutions don't happen overnight, and a revolution requires preparation, grassroots, organizing, money, weapons, internal and international legitimacy and support, and ideological preparation, and a shared vision. So let's start from this concept of a shared vision. To inspire people to unite and to rise against the power that's held over them, you need to first be able to create a cohesive group. Did every Greek living under the Ottomans understand that they belonged to one group of people? Was there maybe regional linguistic, economic, or cultural differences between them that would create a splintered society that would make organization harder? What would need to happen to make everyone understand that they share one common identity? And the other concept you need to have is an understanding of the idea of freedom and what post-freedom would mean. In other words, once you overthrow the Ottomans, who's in charge and what's the next step? There are a number of people who called for freedom. Rigas Fereos, who wrote some of the most famous poetry that inspired the subjugated Greek people, famously declared, "It's better an hour of life that is free than 40 years in slavery." And of course, there was the Filiki Eteria, or the Society of Friends, which was a revolutionary secret society that was founded by merchants in Edessa in 1814 and was led by Alexander Ypsilantis, an officer in the Russian army. And their goal was to overthrow Ottoman rule and to establish an independent Greek state. But I want to focus on one specific man who illustrates this vision very well, and that's Adamantios Korais, who we heard a little bit about in the introduction. He was born in 1748 in Smyrni, but later pursued further education outside of the Greek-speaking world. He ultimately went to Paris, where he moved in intellectual circles and exchanged ideas about politics and statehood and independence and Greek culture and history. And as it is even today, the study of ancient Greek language, literature, and history was a mark of the elite. Educated Europeans and Americans closely studied the classics, and its impact is evident in the poetry and writings of that generation's most important artists, philosophers, politicians, and writers. The impact of ancient Greece is also evident in the architecture around capital cities in Europe and in the US. Greece, the birthplace of democracy, loomed large in the imagination of intellectual elites of these countries. Keep in mind also that Korais was alive during the American Revolution, and he actually witnessed the French Revolution as he lived in Paris at the time. This was an age where ideas of freedom, liberalism, independence, and revolution were spreading in the Western world, and the age of empires was slowly declining. Korais socialized and exchanged ideas with philosophers and politicians, one of whom was Thomas Jefferson himself. Pictured here is a letter that Jefferson wrote in response to Corais, where Corais asked him for advice about Greek independence and possible forms of government. And you can find these letters in the Corais Library on the island of Chios, and also on the Jefferson Monticello Library on the website online. While in Paris, Corais began translating ancient Greek literature into modern Greek. And I want to pause here to note that Greeks were spread throughout Western and Eastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, and they were often separated by great distances and geological barriers, which meant that Greeks spoke distinct idioms or dialects because of this geographical separation. So Corais worked hard to establish a common form of Greek for writing, one that would unite these disparate groups of Greeks under one linguistic umbrella. In short, he did this by translating those ancient Greek works into a common modern Greek. He created a modern Greek dictionary, and he established a Hellenic library. He was part of a larger intellectual movement during this time. So I must stress here the importance of humanistic studies in the development of identity, political and philosophical ideas that created a sense of pride for Greek history and culture. This concept of freedom and independence that we now see as common sense was something that was imagined, it was discussed, it was written about, shared, worked on, and aspired to by scholars and intellectual elite in social circles and in higher education. We see even today that the value of Hellenic studies and humanistic studies more broadly for the cultivation of these foundational concepts that outline our existence as citizens of the United States, as Americans, as Greeks, or as Philhellenes. Greek thought and culture had a serious impact on the creation of the United States, which is evident in the writings of the founding fathers. And on a more obvious level, it's evident in the architecture of Washington, D.C. and big cities around the country, including our own St. Louis. Just think about how many government buildings and academic institutions around the country look like ancient Greek constructions, not to mention private buildings. This was the age of liberty and democracy, and the greatest source for this was classical Athenian political philosophy. This love for classical Greece was not exclusive to the US, of course, as European educated elites read, studied, and mimicked the great literary and historical figures of ancient Greece. Because of this, the Greek fight for independence really resonated with educated American and European aristocrats. And famously, the British poet Lord Byron joined the Greek fighters in Messaloniki, in addition to organizing funding and supplies for the movement. These Philhellenes, as they were called, expressed their love for Greek culture and history by raising funds to support the Greek Revolution, and they produced literary works and art that took the side of the Greeks. An example of this is Delacroix's painting Massacre of Chios, which we're looking at right here. And remember that this was a time before Twitter and the internet, and so art and literature were the means of spreading ideas and stirring emotion. This whirl of support for the Greek cause throughout Europe, however, did not resonate with the rulers of these European countries and in the US. The French monarchy had a long and lucrative friendship with the Ottomans, which would be endangered by a show of support for the Greek Revolution, especially since France was still recovering from its own revolution just a few decades before. The same was the case in England and in the courts and cabinets across Europe. There were Philhellenic groups that formed in England, France, Germany, and Switzerland that raised money and supplies for the cause, and even actual volunteers who wanted to fight alongside the Greeks. The Greek revolutionary fighters had the support of the Philhellenic movement, whose supporters saw the Greek fighters as descendants of the ancient Greeks. So they saw this as a very noble cause. This served as pressure on the European governments to express support, but it was mainly the intra-European competition, the power politics of the great powers, and the rupture in the allegedly solid front of the Holy Alliance, which was the monarchies of Europe, that gradually changed the political scene in favor of the Greeks. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, a political state that the great powers and the US had lucrative trade relationships with, meant a race for control over the broken pieces. Russia, Britain, France, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were struggling to wrangle influence and control over the volatile situation. The foundation of the Greek state was indicative of a change in European politics and of the first phase in the creation of nation states during the 19th century. So now let's zoom in a bit on the internal dimensions of the revolutionary process. Excluded from high-ranking military and political positions in the Ottoman Empire, a proportion of Greeks found success for themselves as part of the merchant class. Historians have countless records that show high volumes of Ottoman trade for items like silks, fabrics, leather, currants, and so on. This foreign traffic for trade led to the development of a useful, independent navy of merchant ship owners, famously from islands like in the Argo-Saronic Gulf, one of which was Spetses, which we'll hear about shortly. Another development that emerged from this growing shipping and trade sector was the establishment of Western European colonies in lucrative areas like the French in the Peloponnese and later the British, Italian, and the Dutch. Lastly, this upward mobility led to Greek merchants and their families settling outside of the Ottoman Empire in the diaspora. There were countless Greek aristocrats who put all of their wealth into the Greek fight for independence, but unfortunately, I don't have the time to talk about more than one. So I decided to focus on Laskarina Bouboulina, who we see here. She was born in 1771, but while pregnant with Bouboulina, her mother traveled from the island of Hydra to a prison in Constantinople where her husband was held captive. It's said that upon seeing the horrible conditions of the prisoners and her husband, Bouboulina's mother gave birth to her there and then on the prison floor. Bouboulina's father died a captive, and a series of struggles brought the widowed mother and her daughter Bouboulina to the island of Spetses. There, Bouboulina grew up and she married and was widowed and married once more and was widowed once more for a second time. But both her husbands were members of the merchant class that I described before, which allowed for them to grow wealthy and create powerful and independent navies. After losing her second husband, Bouboulina took advantage of the fleet in her possession and launched her warships to fight for the revolution. She, like some others, was able to finance the naval campaign almost entirely from her own wealth. She bought weapons and ships, and her famous warship, the Agamemnon, was the largest one on the Greek side. She put most of her wealth into providing ammunition, provisions, food, and ships for the men under her command. Yeah, but knowing the geography of Greece and that it is a collection of islands and peninsulas, which are best controlled by a power that has a command of the sea, helps to highlight the importance of having a strong naval force. This map, I hope, helps illustrate the importance of naval forces, like the one that Bouboulina led to the success of the Greek Revolution. You can see the texture here that the mountains are very rugged and Greece is really surrounded by sea. So the texture of this map illustrates the difficult mountainscape of Greece and the importance of guerrilla fighters who are able to survive in these really inaccessible passes. So this point brings us to our final factor for the success of Greek independence, which was grassroots organizing. Just as I explained for the previous point, there are many heroes of the Greek Revolution, but in the interest of time, I'll focus on just one, Theodore Kolokotronis. Now, Kolokotronis was born in Messenia, but was raised in the Arcadian Mountains. Before becoming a general in the revolution, he was a cleft or a warrior bandit. And before that, he was an armed part of the Ottoman militia, which was composed of Christian Greeks. And in addition to that, he also served in private militias for Greek notables in the region. So Kolokotronis was a man who wore many hats throughout his life and served as a force for different causes. While fighting against the Ottomans for the British Army and the French, he learned military tactics, but also ideas of revolution and independence. And it's said that the French Revolution opened his eyes to this possibility, political possibility for the Greeks. He returned to the Peloponnese with this idea of independence and revolution, and he created a band of klefts, or those warrior bandits, and trained and organized them into a type of army and led them to many of the famous battles that Greeks won against the Ottomans. As we saw before with the map, the mountains break up Greece into isolating areas that make communication difficult for a regular garrison. Because a regular armed force depends on communication, this complication gave a strong advantage to Kolokotronis and his band of klefts over the Ottomans. So this particular Greek landscape was very conducive to the tactics of guerrilla warfare, which really helped Greece's success in this revolutionary fight. So let me summarize by returning to the initial question of why the revolution happened when it did. It's necessary to recognize that for a revolution to begin, there have to be the right factors in place. Ideological and intellectual preparation created and circulated a shared vision of Greek independence. It was the work of intellectuals like Korais and others who shaped the imagination and the emotions of thousands of Orthodox Greeks in the Ottoman Empire and Philhellenes abroad. Another crucial factor is the necessity of internal support, and by that I mean financing, logistics, and manpower. There were many Orthodox Christians who dedicated their wealth and their lives to this great cause of Greek independence, and Bubulina was a remarkable example of this group of leaders. And regarding manpower and guerrilla warfare, Kolokotronis is another great example of leadership and sacrifice. You need to have people who are willing to abandon their civic lives, take risks, and potentially sacrifice themselves in order to fight against a much stronger and a much more well-organized Ottoman army. For the revolution to succeed, it also had to gain recognition and legitimacy on an international level. Greek intellectuals and Philhellenes played a crucial role in mobilizing international public opinion in favor of the Greek cause and putting pressure on the European monarchies whose interests rested with the Ottomans. Many in Europe and the US were moved by the idea that the people who they saw as the descendants of the ancient Greeks were rising up against an Islamic empire. Finally, the geopolitical competition between the great powers of the 19th century to control the trade routes of the Eastern Mediterranean opened a window of opportunity for the Greek revolutionaries to achieve their goal for an independent and free Greece. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. This was wonderful. The context that you provided, going back into the Byzantine period, the historical context, and also the social context, especially the relationship between those groups that were socially mobile and the grassroots organizations and the intellectual movements. Thank you for bringing all this together for us and giving us such a composite picture of the revolution. I know that our audience may be tired. I know there was another event for the Greek community, for the Greek school right before us, but I would still like to have some, to open the floor for some questions and answers. If you have not done this before, you can submit your questions through the chat or just simply raise your hands. And this, I see Ambassador's hand here. So feel free, ideally, if you can just send your question through the chat and then we'll put it to the speaker. Thank you. Ambassador, you can unmute, I think, your microphone yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Monsieur. This was really excellent, an excellent presentation in a nutshell of what happened after the fall of Constantinople. It was really very interesting, and as you said, we could elaborate to a great extent on a number of issues that you mentioned. I just want to put a question, or rather a point on the comparison of the revolution in Greece with the revolutions that, as you said, happened in Europe and in America. Previously and during the Greek Revolution and after also the Greek Revolution. So do you see common grounds? Do you see similarities? Do you see differences between the Greek Revolution and those other revolutions? And if so, which are those elements, similarities or differences? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's really a tough one to answer too, because there's so many facets to it. I think the biggest similarity that we can see among all three is the inspiration that the classics had on these movements. Everybody looked to ancient Greek philosophy and history for the inspiration for ideas of liberty and freedom and democracy, of course.
Great, great. I also have to underline here, however, that the biggest difference between all these revolutions to the Greek Revolution was the fact that the Greeks fought for the liberation from another nation. All the other revolutions in Europe and America were basically against a ruler that was very bad, but it was of the same race. In Greece, the Greeks raised against the Turks, the Ottomans, people of another race, people of another religion. And that makes it, the independence war of Greece, so different from all the other independent, not wars, but revolutions, I believe.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, that it was a clash between Christians and Muslims too. It's something to be pointed out. I completely agree with what you said.
So to what extent did the support from Europe, how crucial was it that it was Christians fighting Muslims in raising support from Europe, besides the love for classical antiquity that you mentioned? Vicky, did you hear me?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. I think it was ideological until we get to the point where Russia enters the stage, and then it becomes interpolitical, where it becomes a fight over who's going to have control over this area of Greece.
Okay, thank you. I see questions coming up here from Tony Zafiropoulos. The question is, what intellectual thinkers influenced Europe and the US besides Corais? I think he means if there are any other cross communications between intellectual thinkers in Europe and the US, the same way that Corais and Jefferson perhaps corresponded. Do we know whether this was part of a larger exchange between European thinkers and US thinkers at all? I don't think it was, but you'll know better.
Personally, this is a little bit outside of my field of specialty, so maybe the investor has a better answer.
Well, I think that the Greek, the New Hellenic Enlightenment and its representatives, not only Corais, but also Rigas, Eugenius Vulgaris, and so many others. First of all these, not all, but many of these people were people of the clergy. They were prelates. These people studied philosophy, science. They lived outside the Ottoman Empire, most of them. And if they came into the Ottoman Empire, they studied or taught in big schools or in Athos. These people got the influence of the European Enlightenment and transmitted to Greece. And in this way, the European thought and the European Enlightenment directly influenced Greece. All these discussions happened almost at the same time. The beginning of the 18th century started the Enlightenment on, and mid and end of the 18th century, the Greek Enlightenment starts as well. So the influence of the European thought is directly transferred and transmitted to Greece. And also we have all this printing, all these houses, printing houses, like in Vienna, like in Paris, like Logios Hermes, for instance, which was a printed leaflet by Greeks in Vienna. And in that document, a lot of thought and proclamations about the revolution were printed and distributed then to Greece. So it was, as you also said, everything was interconnected, and the European thought was transferred to Greece and influenced a lot. Also the Greek representatives of the Enlightenment, but also the European opinion about what was happening later in Greece.
This is brilliant. Thank you for this, Ambassador. You're absolutely right. I think this particular question was about the interaction between American and European intellectuals. So I don't know if you had any knowledge on that besides Corais and Jefferson. I mean,
well, the main, of course, relation here is Corais and Jefferson. As we know, Jefferson, before becoming president, he was ambassador of the United States in Paris. There he met with Corais, and as they were both intellectual, they went into close friendship. They kept great contact while Jefferson was in Paris. And thereafter, when he went to the States and became president, they kept a communication, exchanging letters. But in the States, there were many other people that were belonging to the Enlightenment of the United States. A very important representative of those people is Edward Everett, this huge personality that without him, the United States would not know what was happening in Greece. This person traveled to Greece, to the then Ottoman Empire, came back, wrote a lot about it, spoke a lot about it, and really ignited the light and the sparkle of the Philhellenism in the United States. Of course, there were very many other people that shared his views and took part in that. But also there were people, the American Philhellenes, these people, they were not just simple people. They were part of the upper class of the United States at the time. And these people left the States or wherever they are, like George Jarvis, he was in Hamburg. That was at the time Denmark. And they left everything and went down to Greece to fight. George Jarvis, called Zervis by the Greeks on the spot. Dr. Howe, he was a huge personality in not only in spreading the Philhellenism into the States, but also in supporting. He gathered supplies, medication, clothing, whatever he could, food, and he brought them himself to Greece. He took part as a doctor in very many military events during the revolution. He came afterwards during the Cretan Revolution in 1860s, in the 60s, again with supplies and efforts. His role was huge. Another big personality from the American intelligentsia was Jonathan Peckham Miller, a huge Philhellene. His contribution was, all these issues are not studied. We need more research and study on the American Philhellenes. Peckham Miller was a titan, not only of the Philhellenism, but also as a warrior on the battlefield. He fought in Naupactos, he fought in Mili, he was at Mesologi, he saw the exodus of Mesologi, he wrote back to America about the exodus of Mesologi. I mean, we could talk extensively about all this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move on from Bill Tragos. The revolutions in Europe and America had substantial portions of their populations opposed to them. Who were the most important Greeks who opposed, and what the reasons were for opposing the revolution? Economic or belief in the potential for Greeks to succeed the Ottomans? So maybe any groups who opposed the revolution within Greece?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I alluded to it a little bit in the presentation, but primarily the groups that were opposed to the revolution were the upper echelon Greek Orthodox Greeks who operated at high levels in the Ottoman state, and so it wasn't beneficial to them for this state to crumble. They had worked themselves into a good position, and also upper levels of the church, like at the patriarchate level, were doubted the success of the revolution, and they had the idea that if time moved on, they would be able to maintain their church and the Greek community and Orthodoxy, and also maybe eventually they would regain into the Byzantine Empire, like that prophecy that I talked about. But this doesn't mean that the church was entirely opposed, because we do see priests and bishops on a lower level actually fighting, like Papa Flesas and things like that. So it's a little bit of a more complicated answer for the church, because the church played such a large role in the maintenance of Greek culture and in in identity and other realms for this the revolutionary movement. But there was definitely some pushback in certain strata. But primarily, we saw that there was a resistance to the Greek Revolution for people who were financially stable under the Ottoman power structure.
Thank you, Vicky. From Mr. Apostolos Konstantinidis, do you agree that the Greek commercial fleet that operated from 1453 to 1821 played a crucial role to the success of the Greek Revolution?
I completely agree with this. I think that this point can't be underestimated enough. Sorry, it can't be emphasized enough that power over the seas, control over the seas gives you power over Greece. Even from the Byzantine period up until now, who controls the seas in the Mediterranean, and especially around Greece, this is very crucial. So that Bouboulina and many people like her took their commercial ships and equip them with military equipment so they can fight the Ottomans. This was a big game changer.
Thank you. From Dimitrios Matsakis, what would you say was the biggest mistake made by the Greek revolutionaries? If it is fighting among themselves, do you think freedom could have been won on better terms had they been united?
This is a very hard question for historians to answer. There was a lot of mistakes. Obviously, infighting was a very big problem. I think the biggest surprise that comes to people who just begin to read about the Greek Revolution is that Kolokotronis is imprisoned by Greeks. This always comes as a big shock. And when I've taught this in class, it blows students' minds why Greeks would do this to each other. So this is a difficult question for a historian to answer.
From Finn Kennett, how is Greek Independence Day usually celebrated in Greece?
I'll actually kick that to you, Michali, if you want to answer that, since you've lived it more than I have.
Yes,
I've only had a few years here.
Lots of parades, celebrations, concerts. This year is particularly special. I think the ambassador would be able to answer this better than I can, just because you have a more global view of the celebrations there.
Yes, but I agree. What you said is exactly right. Of course, now with the coronavirus, the celebrations were very simple. There were no parades except for the big one in Athens. That was really a majestic parade indeed. And the events on the Acropolis, the flag raising and the national anthem that we just saw at the beginning of this event. But usually we have parades in every little village, in every town, in every place, with students, with the army. We have flag raisings, we have wreath laying, and of course we have a lot of other activities, cultural activities, like concerts, like theaters, like exhibitions. Actually, the new National Gallery in Greece is now opening to the public with a fantastic collection showing the revolution. It's a unique indeed. And whoever managed to go to Greece this year, I strongly suggest to go and visit that presentation. The new gallery that just opened actually these days.
Thank you. And there's also, let me add that there's also a wonderful exhibition of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens titled "Γι' αυτά πολεμήσαμε," this is what we fought for, basically connecting classical Greek antiquity with the revolutionaries and the fighters. So as the ambassador said, if you go to Greece, you need to go to see all these exhibitions. From Constantine, I don't know if this is Leanne, what informed the average revolutionary when talking about how the average Greek person conceptualized his identity? Was it different based on who they were talking to, meaning more classical Greek when talking to the West and more Orthodox when talking to the Russians? Vicky?
I think the easiest answer to this is it really depends on the level of education. I don't think we could expect people who live in the Arcadian Mountains who hadn't really traveled outside of this district to be able to talk about the merits of Homer. So I think for them it would be orthodoxy, but for people like in the ranks of Korais, it would have to be classics, especially since Korais really disliked the Byzantine Empire. I think I owe it to the audience to express that he did not really approve. So it really depends on education.
Thank you. From Nikki Kutraku, would you share your thoughts on the possible influence of other ideological trends, such as Orientalism in art and Romanticism in literature, on the development of Philhellenism? So what other ideological trends shaped the Philhellenic movement? Maybe can you think of one or two examples?
What I think that those are the primary influences that played a role for Philhellenes. I'm not sure if either of you have a more detailed answer, but from my understanding, I would agree with that.
And let's close with two questions. It's almost three. Tony Zafiropoulos, what other commanders besides Bouboulina and Kolokotronis do you suggest he does some more research on?
I think I want to avoid maybe giving, I don't want to do injustice to other fighters. So maybe if the person who asked the question sends me an email, I can give them a list of some sources too, because I could name some fighters, but there might not be literature in English, or if the person prefers it in Greek, I can do it that way better. So I think that would probably be the best answer I could give.
Tony, I will email you Vicky's email so you can ask her directly.
Could I just add something to what Professor Curie just said? Well, it's, of course, as you said, it's very, very difficult to name all of them. And especially, I always underline those that were not shown, those that did not attract the light on them, that their contribution was also vital. But on land, except for Kolokotronis, of course, it was Karaiskakis, for me, the biggest figure. Marco Botzaris, who unfortunately passed away very quickly, and he didn't have the chance to really develop his strategic possibilities. Now, at sea, we have so many, Canaris, Miaoulis, Papanikoulis, all of them were really vital. People also that offered their belongings without directly participating in the fights, like Madame Avrogenous. She also was a very important personality for the fight. So, but this is again a very long discussion.
It is, and I think this particular person needs literature in English, so we need to figure out which ones we can. So, thank you.
That's the tough part too, because it's only recently that even in Greek historiography that there have been writings about specific warriors. It used to just be kind of a generic history, but especially this year with the bicentennial, a lot of books have come out where it's an individual biography for these warriors. And the literature, even if you just study the revolution in English, it's few and far between, and a lot of these books are pretty dated. So it's difficult to find works except for Kolokotronis, we have that in English, his monograph. But it's hard to find things in English for the Greek Revolution. So maybe it's inspiration for the younger kids in the audience to maybe study this and pursue a doctoral degree studying Greek Revolution, maybe add to this literature.
Actually, Vicky, if you could compile a short list of titles in English for specific commanders, including the ones that the ambassador mentioned, if we have any titles, we'll put them up on the website, of the professorship website. So
yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, I'll do that.
Great, thank you. Final question from Dimitris Matsakis. What does the Turkish ambassador do on March 25? And how about the Greek ambassador on May 29? I don't know. I don't know if you have the answer to that.
Well, on March 25th, often Turkish ambassadors participate in our National Day. Now, May 29th is not the National Day of Turkey. The National Day of Turkey is in October, and that was the date of the inauguration of the Turkish Republic as it is today. And in these events, also the Greek ambassadors participate at the celebrations. We have diplomatic relations with Turkey, and we have civil, behavior between one another, despite our differences. And also, I want to underline the very good relation between the people of Greece and Turkey in this respect.
Thank you. And let me close with a comment by Pam Schaefer. As members of the Nakis family, I won't read the whole message, but basically, Vicky, the Nakis family is thanking you for this lecture, and they are looking forward to meeting you when they get back to St. Louis.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to do this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of our panelists and also our audience, for staying in time. I had promised that I would keep this short. It is 3 o'clock, so let me close here. Let me mention that we had a wonderful audience. There were, at some point, there were 75 people on Zoom and another 50 on YouTube. So it was over 120 people who attended this. Thank you all for joining us. Please visit greekstudies.org. Vicky, we very much appreciate your giving this presentation. Thank you, Ambassador. We're honored to have you with us today. Thank you all. Let me just close by thanking Bob L, who took care of all the technical information, of all the technical details. Bob, thank you. And Liane Constantine, the head of Amstel Global, for her support. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon and Chronia Pola. Bye-bye. Bye.